I want to welcome everybody to the Jack Benny podcaster panel. And I have some introductions for everyone here today. So we have our resident Jack Benny fan club podcasters. We have Buck Benny, where he has his own personal panel of researchers that he does in his podcast. They do a dive into episodes, explaining context before airing the episode. So we also have John Henderson with his This Day in Jack Benny podcast.
Hello.
Hi. It's so much fun. I know Laura has your shirt on right now. Yes, it's a fun podcast. You also look up some of the more topical jokes, and you're also a panelist on Buck's podcast as well.
He keeps showing up. I don't know why.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because you love him.
Yeah. It's a little bit of a feud going, right?
Yes.
And we have, of course, our organizer, Zach Eastman, who deals mostly with classic films and the yesteryear Ballyhoo Review in particular. Of course, he loves Jack. So there's a lot of Jack films and a lot of old radio star films that you can hear in his podcast. We also have James Scully with the Breaking Walls podcast, which I thank you, Zach, for turning me on to that. That was amazing. I've been listening to tons of the radio broadcasts and just all the historical context with that. It's an amazing podcast. And the very first podcast I ever listened to was Mark Malkoff's podcast.
Oh,
We talked about this like 3 years ago.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
but the very first podcast I listened to was the Carson podcast, which, as we all know, Johnny idolized Jack. So
yeah.
I am Hope Sears. I am our moderator today. I'm a former podcaster of all of the classics. Now I pretty much, the only classic I participate in is that video that you just saw 2 hours ago for the intro to Jack Benny. So my podcast is on an indefinite hiatus that keeps trying to get me to come back. Yeah.
We're demanding it. I've had you on not within the last couple of weeks on Ballyhoo. I want all the classics back. That's my personal statement on the matter. I miss it.
Well, thank you. Yeah. I would if I didn't have another job.
And I wanted you to join us on our panel sometime.
I would love to. Maybe see. I'm perfectly fine being a guest star. I don't want my own starring role anymore. I'm tired of myself talking. Yes. So of course the question that is first up is, how did you all learn or get into Jack Benny? Who wants to start first?
I got into Benny because Carson would talk about him all the time. I remember when I think I was in high school when who was it? Kelsey Grammer did a Jack Benny special, a primetime one that I really, really liked. But I think it really, for me, obviously at the Carson podcast, was just in reading and print interviews, how much revered Johnny would talk about Jack and the timing and everything. And just, it was like one of those things when I saw Jack Benny for the first time, I'm like, oh, wow, I can see so much of Carson. I mean, like, this is what he was talking about.
Yeah. Yes. I definitely, I love going back to that little clip of Carson on his show where he's imitating Jack and saying, hey, I do things exactly how you do, and I don't think it's fair.
Yeah.
Yes. Zach, how did you get into Benny and get into podcasting about Benny?
For Benny at large, I got into Charlie McCarthy first, because everybody loves a dummy that is real. He's a real person. Nobody ever dispute that, please. But anyway, my dad got me a comedy superstar set from Radio Spirits from Costco that had Charlie McCarthy on it, and I wanted him to listen to one with me. And he said, "Well, before we do that, can you listened to this one with me, and it was Jack Benny with his guest Groucho Marx from, I believe, 1944. And I had already known who Groucho was from watching Duck Soup, thanks early Netflix DVDs. I listened to it, and I didn't get it at first, but then after I wore out Charlie McCarthy, I started listening to the Jack one because my dad likes it. Maybe I'll like it. And eventually I'm like, why is Phil Harris here? Why is the voice of Baloo here? Why is Johnny Appleseed on here? And then slowly but surely I got into Jack, and started finding him to be a big warm blanket to huddle around me. But podcasting about him came about because I started a show called Yesteryear Ballyhoo Review, which is a show that we tackle laughter and lessons from Golden Age Hollywood. So we chuckle along with the film, and with any plot description, you can find things to riff on, but also kind of trying to contextualize elements of the era, whether it's racism, sexism, the way that people are addressing certain things in dialogue, what is able to be shown and not able to be shown, and to try to grow and evolve from that for future art. And Jack's film career is kind of actually full of those instances. So I kind of started with trying to give attention to his film career with Laura's help. And then eventually we did Buck Benny Rides Again, Man About Town. Hope, you and I did George Washington Slept Here. She may be attending today, but Cheryl Jones might be in the audience. She did the episode about the horn blows at midnight with Jack. And there's plans to do some more Jack films, but on episode 39, I decided to do like a whole 3.5 hour Benny Palooza, where I told stories from Bessie Love's book about Jack's film career, talked about the character, tried to kind of do what you did with the Jack Benny video, but too long and with so many episodes that I could fit into the timeline. So yeah, that's why I've kind of done it, is that like it's an interesting extension off of Jack's radio career as his film career as well. And I'm fascinated by a film career that technically failed. Not literally, because To Be or Not to Be is great, but technically it wasn't great.
John, how did you get into Jack Benny and into the podcasting?
Well, when I was probably in junior high, my brother came home from school and he was all excited because his teacher told him about a thing called old time radio. And it was on our local talk radio station from 11 p.m. till 1 a.m. And I was like, well, that's past my bedtime. I can't watch that. Until we figured out how to program our cassette radio to tape it. So every night we would tape the old radio shows from the night before. I remember the first time we put it in, we started listening, and it was suspense. And, it's got that melodramatic music, suspense. And we're laughing and making fun of it and pushing each other over because it's so silly. And about halfway through, we're on the edge of our seats, sweating because it is so intense and scary. And we're like, yeah. But then, we kept listening, because I think each night they played 4 shows. So we listened to the next show. So we started listening regularly. And our favorites were the science fiction shows. And we tolerated some of the other shows because we didn't really have the context for them. And then after about a year, we heard the first episode again. And I was like, oh, I guess they played all the old radio shows. I guess that's it. So I stopped listening. And then a couple years later, my parents, I think, got the same Costco set that Zach was talking about. I got a few of those and started listening to the tapes until I realized that the radio was still playing new episodes. They just recycled one or something. So I started to get to know the Jack Benny characters, because Jack Benny's the kind of show where right off the bat, at least for me when I was a kid, you don't quite get it. But every time you listen to it, you start to understand the characters, and it builds more and more. So I had a general idea of Jack Benny along with all the old radio shows that I had heard. And then in probably 2015, I started listening to Jack Benny along with other old radio shows on podcasts, because I, spent some time in college where I would only listen every once in a while. And so I started listening to this podcast called Jack Benny and OTR Podcast, among other ones. And this guy was rambling on and on about Jack Benny. And I was like, I want to hear the episode. So I thought, you know what I should do? I should start my own podcast that's only a 2-minute intro. So I did that. And as it turns out, I still enjoyed listening to that other episode. And I don't know, maybe I made a mistake. Maybe longer intros are better. I don't know. Maybe we'll find out soon.
Would that longer intro happen to be Buck Benny?
That is correct, yes.
So Buck, how did you get into podcasting?
Okay, well, I'll give you a quick overview. It'd take too long to talk about, but essentially, I watched the Jack Benny specials with my parents back in the 70s. And so I remember that. I remember how much my family enjoyed watching them. And then right around that same time frame is when radio had a resurgence. And so I remember my sister listening to the 0 Hour and CBS Radio Mysteries. And I liked those, and I thought they were interesting. And then jump forward a few years, and I remember our Fred Meyer had little cassette tapes of like The Shadow and things that I'd pick up in Gunsmoke and listen to those and realize how great those were. And then there was kind of an empty space for a long time. And then it's interesting. I think it's interesting how we all mentioned the Costco sets, because that's the kind of the common thing that drives us in it. And it would be neat if Costco still sold sets like that, because you don't realize what a reach they have to an audience that hasn't heard this before and might pick it up. So anyway, so I saw the Costco set of Gunsmoke there, and I had this commute to work. I got a new job, and so I worked about an hour. It was an hour commute each way, so 2 hours every day I was in the car. And I got tired of listening to books on tape and things, so I saw that set at Costco, and then I just because I'm cheap like Jack, I checked. I decided to look on eBay and see what they had, and then they had sets of Gunsmoke with like 500 episodes on MP3, right? And so it was like, oh my goodness, because the set at Costco, I think it's 60 episodes or 20 episodes, I can't remember. Anyway, so I bought that thing with the 500 episodes and listened to that back and forth to work. And then I just I got into some forums that were like old time radio forums and asked about them. And I kept on hearing Suspense and Jack Benny come up as ones that were really good. So I got sets of those and listened to those, and I just fell in love with Jack Benny. I mean, it was just, it took a while. I mean, you need to listen to about 10, 15 episodes, and then all of a sudden you start to get it. And then I loved it and listened to all the episodes, and I slowly listened to less Gunsmoke and less Suspense and more of Jack. And then pretty soon it was Jack for 2 episodes going to work, 2 episodes coming home every day. And so I would burn through his episodes pretty quickly. And then I always wanted to share about them, and there was just, how do I do that? And no one knew about them. And then the whole podcasting thing kind of developed. And so I think I started the first podcast of any of us, I'm not sure, back in like 2006, 2007. I started
with California
releasing the shows, and I looked around to see if there's anybody introing shows like I wanted, and no one was doing it. So I decided to do it. And then kind of like John, I decided to do it because no one was doing it. John decided to do it because the only person doing it was doing a lousy job. And so John wanted to do a better job. Anyway, so that's kind of how the whole thing.
Well, I should say, I actually think on this particular episode, you said, oh, I've been going on as long as the show itself. Maybe I talked too long. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't talk as long. And then I thought that reminded me of the rule I learned in radio about like succinctness and keeping things short. I worked on the radio where you have 45 seconds to maybe 2 minutes, and that's it. So that's where I was coming from.
You want to know who's really good at that? Is James keeps things very succinct, and we haven't introed him yet. I think we should actually roll a clip if Zach has it ready.
Yeah, ladies and
of his podcast. Zach, is it going?
Ladies and gentlemen, if you can all hear me,
I know
stand
we
by.
were
We're
kind
gonna
of
see if
having
this clip
issues.
assembly that I put together works for James here. Okay.
I can barely hear you, so I hope. I don't know what you just said.
My mic's low. I'm trying to account for the auto gain situation that's being noted today. So sorry. Stand by, gentlemen and ladies. Let's see if this works.
I primarily was a California actor, euphemistically, glamorously called Hollywood. Indeed, there were the New York actors, the shows that came out of New York in the golden days of radio were primarily of a documentary sense and very often a more literate sense, very often a more substantial sense. Chicago was primarily a soap opera production center because the slaughterhouses in those days were in Chicago where the soap was being manufactured of animal fats.
That's interesting.
That's exactly the reason for it. And the sponsors' wives who decided upon the artistic merits of any artist were in close proximity to the production. And Hollywood then, you see, when I began at 35, just at that point, San Francisco was the big town on the coast. And up to that point, motion picture artists, motion picture performers were forbidden to appear on radio for fear they would lose their glamour. And since tickets cost 35 cents a piece to go to the motion pictures, there was a real problem until someone's nephew, I suppose, in one studio decided, let our actor, our movie star, step into your living room. And the phrase was born, and suddenly there became a vogue for motion picture actors. Now, the movie star was named and starred. He was the great glamorous attraction. And that's how Hollywood expanded into the glamour show. But those surrounding him were the workaday able actors who played part after part after part.
In the fall of 1948, 4 of radio's top 7 shows still originated from NBC's KFI in Los Angeles. One of the most valuable NBC time slots was Sunday night at 6:30. It served as the lead-in to the Jack Benny program. For years, it had been occupied by the great Gildersleeve.
Yeah, I asked Zach to stop the clip, so thank you. not just cringe because I'm hearing my own voice, but so I'm James Scully. It's nice to see some people like John and Buck over here, who I've corresponded with, but never seen face to face. And so I produce a show.
I invite you every week on my show, though, man.
I know. I think it's because it's a little early in the morning for me, and I'm so, I mean, I grew up in a house with my grandparents and great-grandparents in New York City. I had great-grandparents who were born in 1918 and 1920, and my grandparents were born in 1941 and 44. Very New York. I mean, he's not a New Yorker, but Studs Terkel is somebody I looked up to a lot as a kid, and he grew up in a Chicago boarding house, and I kind of likened it similar to that it was 2 families up and down. So I was getting lots of oral history, grew up listening to, classic music, Nick at Night television. I remember when Turner Classic Movies started, but the first time I ever remember seeing Jack Benny is probably the mouse that Jack built, the 1959 cartoon, which obviously if you know it's Jack, great, but at the very end they show Jack sitting in his robe in his chair, and he has this puzzled look on his face. But like everybody else, I got really exposed to the golden age of radio because of Costco, and specifically the Walter Cronkite selects the 60 greatest radio shows of the 20th century set that my grandmother wound up buying my grandfather for Christmas 1999, and I was 13 at the time. So I think I was just old enough to really appreciate the golden age of radio, old enough to sit through that kind of stuff. And fast forward years later, I went to college here in New York City, art and design college called Pratt. I was still listening to the golden age of radio, playing stuff on the background. If you're doing visual art, it's kind of easy to listen to something like that. Yada, yada, yada. Years later now, I'm running an art collective. I started an interview podcast called Breaking Walls. That's great, but I'm not Joe Rogan, so the drop off from one episode to the next is substantial because people, hope they'll come listen to your episode, your friends, and they don't care about John on the next episode. No offense, John. But so nobody, it's hard to retain an audience if nobody knows who you are. But I was running this art collective and also kind of doing on the scene reporting. Chuck Shaden was nice enough to give me an interview in February of 2017. And over the course of that year, I slowly started to map out, hey, I love Ken Burns. Nobody's doing a Ken Burns style audio documentary podcast on the history of radio. At least I hadn't seen one. And that's how Breaking Walls becomes a history of radio show. And that's the elevator ride to the top of the One World Trade Center pitch. So that's what I do. Jack has showed up several times. I guess the first Jack episodes I remember hearing were probably Christmas episodes from the late 30s. I covered Jack exclusively in one episode on the I Can't Stand Jack Benny contest and the 45-46 season, which I think is some of the best writing they had ever done. He shows up constantly, like in the clip that Zach was just playing. That's on network radio in the fall of 1948. Obviously, Jack Benny jumps from NBC to CBS beginning in January of 1949. What you didn't hear there is it starts off talking about Ozzie and Harriet, who jumped back to NBC or jumped to NBC to be the lead-in, and they were like, hey, this is great. We're going to be leading the Jack Benny. And then, 3 months later, Jack's gone and they're rating Crater. And what people don't realize also is until say Valentine's Day, 1949, Ricky and David Nelson were played by voice actors. When they're rating Craters and the two kids are constantly pestering Ozzie and Harriet to let us play ourselves, let us play ourselves, let us play ourselves. When they're rating Craters so much, Ozzie's basically like, well, screw it, let's try it. They do a table read and Ricky's charisma at like 8 years old comes through immediately. And the audience at the table read they're loving it. And so it's like, okay, we're going to try them out. So actually Jack Benny jumping to CBS is why Ricky Nelson became a star. Of course, I think he would have become a star anyway because he's Ricky Nelson.
That's great.
But, little story there.
Real quick for you, I was just wondering, like, you have really short clips, a lot of them. Some of them are a little longer, but like 30 minutes. But a lot of yours are like, just a couple of minutes too. How do you find all of these wonderful interviews? Like, what is your process? Do you choose a topic first, or do you look for an interview first? Are you breaking them down into multiple, like, different episodes? What's your process for choosing?
Thank you for bringing that up, because I owe a lot of thanks to people like Dick Bertel and Ed Corcoran, who had a show in the 1970s on WTIC in Hartford called The Golden Age of Radio, and they interviewed a lot of radio stars. That Hans Conried clip is from August of 1971. That's from their show. Chuck Shaden has been nice enough to let me use his interviews, as well as Spurback and I'm a member of Spurback, a former board member. They've always been nice enough to do that. But I started listening to John Dunning interviews. I found an interview with with Bob Bailey's daughter, Roberta Bailey Goodwin, and a Dennis Day interview that John. Dunning had written the Encyclopedia of Old Time Radio. I had that in my house as a kid. And when I found his interviews, this is before I was doing a podcast. I was just listening to interviews. So anyway, when Breaking Walls became a history of radio show, episode 75, the first thing I did was I went back to the beginning of radio and realized I've got to teach myself this stuff as I'm going. There are so many people who know much more than me, but I'm going to go forward chronologically. And then I started skipping around, and now I'm at the point where it's like, what haven't I covered? What do I want to cover? The short clips, I've gone away from them beginning in January 2022. I used to do one long docu-podcast every month, like 3 hours, and then the rest of the month would be filled up with short clips from other people's shows, like, the gentlemen and ladies who I've just mentioned. But then people would message me, and they thought I was just somebody who aggregated clips of shows. They didn't realize I was making these documentaries. Also, these shows are like 3.5 hours long. So I said, well, what if I just break them up into chunks and roll them out over the course of the month, every month? So that's now the format. Plus, I don't offer Breaking Walls up for sponsorship because what you heard there, the music, that's from a movie called High Spirits, a Peter O'Toole comedy movie from the late 80s. Steve Guttenberg's in it. It's a movie I liked growing up. Because the copyright law is so murky with old time radio, I realize I'm destroying copyright law as is. So now I'm going to go all the way in the other direction and just start using music that I want to use too, because I can't offer these up for sponsorship. But at least if I'm cutting up my own show into parts, I'm not getting downloads and plays on stuff that I don't deserve in the case, which is like, Dick Patel's interviews and things like that. So that's a very long way to answer that question, but
yeah, it's fine. It did answer a lot of my thoughts behind it, because you do a very good job of doing like the audio documentary style. If anybody hasn't listened to the Breaking Walls podcast, I know somebody was asking what the podcast name was earlier. That is a fantastic resource. So definitely you have clips of pretty much every radio show and his from every kind of genre, news clips and stuff as well. So it's very comprehensive. So I would recommend that for anybody that's just starting to jump in and maybe has a niche interest or maybe wants to dabble into something new. There are a lot of snippets of something. But I also was reading in the comments that like me, there's a young person that also kind of first got into podcasts and stuff through Mark again. So I was just wondering, Mark, you spoke to Joan Benny.
Yeah.
What was your impressions from that interview?
I just think from talking to her, first of all, she was on Johnny's 6th ever show. I have the calendars too, like the town quarter used back then, because a lot of dates are wrong. I went to her apartment on Park Avenue, and she just seemed really excited to talk about her parents and just being there and just how much she misses them. And she mentioned some other stuff I'm not going to say about one of Johnny Carson's wives. That was after, but I just felt that it's one of those times where she gets to go back and relive the thing. And I don't think she has that much of a chance normally to do so. But she was great, lovely place. Yeah, my wife Christine went with me. Yeah, really, just amazing. I was so glad to get her on the podcast. I wrote her a letter. I think I just wrote her a letter, and she emailed me. Yeah.
Is that how you got the interview? Is you just? I know that you like kind of sometimes just put out those feelers, and eventually some of them get back to you.
Yeah, if I don't know their email or I can't get in touch, I try to sometimes send letters. It's worked. It's bizarre that it works so well, but yeah, no, that's been.
So note to anybody trying to get a hold of a celebrity, send them a letter.
I just want to mention one thing that I don't know if you guys know about. Carson, when he was 17, hitchhiked to Los Angeles, and it was right before he was joining the Navy. And he had an aunt and uncle that were in the area. And it was his first time he was really there on his own. And he somehow, I think through a star map, actually went to Jack Benny's home and just stood in front, just gawking, and just waiting for Jack to come out and mow his lawn. And then Carson said, he realized years later, they had someone to mow Jack's lawn for them. They paid somebody. But just the fact that was like the first thing when he got there was there. And then he went to a uniform store, like military, and dressed up like a naval officer, and went into the U.S. shows and was promptly arrested after like a day or two. But then they let him go. But Jack was number one for him.
Yeah, Jack was
That's how I met John too. John was on my lawn, and I said, "Get off my lawn, John." But
Jack was known to. Can everybody hear me? All right.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Jack was known to actually like go up and talk to the fans too. So he wouldn't have been off in trying to maybe get a glance at Jack. It's a different atmosphere then than it was now. Like now everything's gated up. Like you go to LA or walk down into Beverly Hills, everything's got a gate and a 5-foot like ivy covered wall. But yeah, like people would go up to Roxbury and just talk to him, say hello.
I've talked to people that did that. I mean, Jimmy Stewart, you could knock on the doors. Ray Bolger, the Scarecrow of Oz, come on in. And it was Katharine Hepburn here in New York. It's amazing to think about, but I love to hear the stories how Jack was so nice, how personable he was, and he had respect for his audience.
I'd like to know how, Mark, you started your podcast.
I just wanted answers to my questions, which is how was the Carson show put together in terms of like, how did they, everything that went on behind the scenes. And I had all these questions about Johnny, and there was, for a guy that was that famous for 30 years, a lot of people say the most recognizable man in America for 30 years, there wasn't a lot of stuff out on him. He was a pretty private guy. His friends had never talked about him publicly for the most part, and his staff as well. So I just wanted my answers, like what was he doing behind the scenes? How did he put the show together? And then people started talking about his personal life and being friends with Carson as well. But I just wanted, it was just because there wasn't anything else out there that was answering my Carson questions. And I just loved, like when I was a kid watching that show. I mean, it was like, in terms of entertainment, it was everybody was on that show. And it was such an education on entertainment, the fashion that was going on at the time. Yeah, it's really like somebody said, a historical time capsule.
Yeah, it definitely is. And that's why your podcast is so fascinating. You have, I mean, it was an interview show, so it had a lot of different guests on and very topical. Have any of your other guests that you can remember mentioned Jack Benny?
I know they have. I interviewed almost 400 people. I know I'm gonna, after this I'm gonna be I'm gonna mention it, but I can't think of any. Real quick, I'm sure you know this, maybe not, that the one time Johnny Carson, or second time ever he didn't do a monologue was when Jack died. Did you all know that? You probably all knew that. He didn't do any monologue. He came out and sat right at his desk and just talked about Jack and ran a videotape. I'm guessing you guys knew this, but
I knew it, but I'm not sure that everybody.
I just don't think that the clip is available to the public. That was what I was I was thinking. But no, he cried. Carson was so private with his emotions, and it was like one of the only times he didn't go to funerals either, very often, that he was just weeping when Jack died, like weeping.
Yeah.
Yeah, last night we watched the special, Jack Benny's first farewell special, and it opens with Johnny Carson, and he talks about when he was a kid and his admiration of Jack Benny.
Yeah, it's definitely very special. It's crazy how special that was for Johnny, that relationship. Did anyone else interview Joan Benny? I'm just curious. I know that Laura, of course, has. Any other of the podcasters interview Joan? Yeah. She was, I feel like she was also very private for the most part. That was a very special interview to come across on your podcast.
I just want to mention, it had nothing to do with me. When I didn't know this when I started the podcast, when I asked people to talk about Johnny Carson, they, for the most part, had never had a chance to talk about him in any length. And it was like, I had no idea that this was like one of the best parts of their lives, like reliving, like they went to college, they loved this so much, and they don't have an outlet to talk about it. So it was definitely more Johnny, but I was glad that Miss Benny said yes. And she answered all my questions. She was great.
Mm-hmm. This is not like relevant at all, but I just one thing that I like really remember from that was she like dated Frank Sinatra, and she just kind of said that casually, and also, but he wasn't interested in her, and you were like, why do you say that? And he just went on 2 dates with me and then never called back.
Carson and Joan Benny had dinner at least once, and I mentioned that in the episode, and you can hear her like, how did you know that? Like, it's my job.
Yes, she was so excited. And that's something I want to know. Like, I've asked this on my podcast, but how do you, and this is something I want to know from Zach too, how do you both dive in so much that like, I'm like, I don't know where you found that. I tried.
Zach, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. Sorry if I keep asking if anyone can hear me. There's a issue with OBS auto leveling me for some reason. When I dig in, I've been fortunate enough since being part of the fan club for years, but also working with SpurredVac now, to be able to find information and clips that I look for in deep dive. So it really kind of boils down to just kind of knowing what is the most important part of the discussion and what needs to be addressed. And if it's not clips, it's also resource material and interviews that are like in print. In the case of Jack, it's actually been trying to connect when he was promoting the films that he was starring in, and trying to find the best correlating sketch to play at the top of the show that may or may not sum up the film, because part of the issue is that Jack, when he was promoting his films on the air, would give fake plot synopses for some of those films, especially in the late 30s. By the time you get to The Horn Blows at Midnight, it becomes very specific. But in the case of researching those to figure out like how to tell those stories, Variety has been a wonderful resource to trace timelines. And in fact, we wouldn't have been able to do a Horn Blows at Midnight episode had I not been able to look into Variety and find out that there was a flu epidemic in late 43 and 44, and it explained a mask that Jack was wearing in a publicity photo. So there was an outbreak that basically, similar to COVID, took down studio productivity from anywhere from 2 to 5%. Millions of dollars were lost. People were basically like told to go home for a week or two. And if you actually read further into like newspapers.com about that little epidemic that was going on, you kind of hear similar language to what was happening in our current history with COVID, where people either think it's a big deal or don't think it's a big deal. So that ended up providing some interesting context into what was the condition of the studio at the time Jack was making that film, and keeping in mind that the timeline on that film is crazy because he was going anywhere from the East to the West Coast doing shows for the military at the time. So you kind of factor in his schedule for Warner Brothers combined with his radio schedule. And that's a lot of what that is looking into the timeline of where Jack was at any given point. This is a guy who, Bob Hope gets credit for zip-zapping around the country, but Jack might have actually visited more bases than Bob in a lot of respects, and he was constantly active. But I will tell you, though, also, other podcasts are a good resource. I've used anywhere from Buck to John to James here, all the way to other shows like the Marx Brothers Council podcast, for episodes of my show, just to be like, okay, I want to hear other historians and experts. I don't want to assume that I know everything in the room. So I'll if you wonder why some of the shows are 3 hours, a lot of it is me prefacing that I don't know everything. And so within that, I like to try to get other people's perspective and try to gather all the information, let the audience use it as a springboard to go from there on the research. We did an episode on George Washington Slept Here, Hope. It was the most weird way you could introduce Hattie McDaniel into our show, but we did a whole bio about her and talking about how she's treated in that film as comparison to her white counterparts. Well, that's a springboard for a larger discussion. And we can cull from the resources we have, but we also know that it's not the definitive source. It's the gateway to learning more about somebody like Hattie McDaniel, who was in a Jack film, but she's also obviously she is the first African-American to win an Oscar for acting. So there's springboards that come off of it. And Jack ends up being a great springboard for discussion because, especially when it comes to Rochester and the way the films that he did with Rochester really break barriers on accident. And Kathy has this in her book. It was a valuable resource to read that. There's a sense that actually they were able to circumvent Southern censors because that relationship with Jack and Rochester was so ingrained that they were fooling Southern censors.
Yeah.
And in the result, you can get away with imagery like Jack and Rochester sitting at a table together eating, like in Man About Town.
Yeah.
And you have to balance the positive and the negative in that respect, because obviously it is not perfect. But it leads to the innovation of like the later New Year's Eve show where Jack and Rochester kick their feet up on the couch. That's like a full decade before Uhura kisses Kirk on Star Trek. You know, like it's interesting to see how Jack and Rochester broke barriers before other people did in that respect. And those are the things that I want to deep dive on. And like Kathy's book is a good resource for everybody out there. I've used that in my shows more than I can count. It's the most valuable non-family member or management member Benny book that you can find that has like key information about that his life and his career.
Yeah.
I'll answer real quick. I Google, I sometimes look at hundreds of things. Like Google is probably my best resource, and I find the most obscure things that they've never said in an interview. They said it maybe one time, and I'm just like, how do people not know that? And I was fortunate that people a lot of times would be like, nobody's ever asked me that. Or how did you know that? So YouTube videos, I always will put my guest in YouTube and see if they have interviews. eBay, surprisingly, because a lot of times you'll see what old things that they did. Not everything's listed online, and I'm just like, how did I not know this? Or this Paley Center has a lot of stuff that you can't find anywhere. The Museum of TV, in radio. But yeah, that's basically, or like for the most part. I do some other stuff, but that's what I do. And my rule, I try to make this, if they've been asked a question before in any interview, except like maybe if they said it once, like 30 years ago, I try not to ask the question. They're normally asked the same things almost in every interview. I know one I did, their publicist was like, that's never happened. They always ask the same stuff. And yeah, so I do the deep dive. Sometimes I wish I didn't because it's so
really
time consuming, as everybody knows, all of you.
I have a question for everybody here. How do you get sleep?
Yeah. But I wanted to actually go to Buck, since other people are saying that other podcasters are definitely a resource, and you have a bunch of people that are all doing deep dives on your podcast. How did you kind of start that? How did you start kind of like the brain trust of Jack Benny?
Well, it sort of started with doing Zoom. I'm a school counselor, as some people know, and so we started doing Zoom during the pandemic, of course. And I just thought, what a cool tool to bring people together. And so I started using that to just interview various people. And one of the first people I was interviewing was Kathy Fuller Seeley. And so I was talking to Kathy, and we did this interview, and it just went really, really well. And I just kind of casually said, you know, I've been looking at introducing the Jack Benny television shows on YouTube. I did one. Okay, so I introduced Jack's first show, and I did it myself, just me. And it's kind of cute. It's me doing in color. And then I go, something feels wrong here. And I snap my fingers and I turn to black and white. And I go, oh, now this feels right. And then I introduced a show, and it's a little short interview, a little short intro piece. But I was like, you know, I think this works on the radio show, but I think watching me just on video, introducing a video of Jack, it's not exciting enough. It's not dynamic enough. And so I thought, maybe if I bring in other people. And so since I happened to be interviewing her at the time, I just asked her if she wanted to join me. And she said, yeah, I'd love to do that. So then I got her on board. When I had her on board, I'd already had John do some work with me in the past. And so I just reached out to John and saw if he wanted to join us, and he did. And then within a week or two, I think Kathy, John, and I did a couple. And then within a couple of weeks, Terry showed up. And so I just kind of, he was asking me, he was kind of creating his own kind of old time radio thing and just wanted to get my opinion on some things. And I'm like, I'm kind of busy. I don't really have time for this. And then he's like, well, I'd really like to talk to you. And I'm like, all right. Let's do a Zoom and we'll chat with each other. I got on the Zoom with him and he was so interesting and knew so much stuff. And he had this background in news and everything. And I thought, man, that would be an interesting piece to have that as well in our panel. And I asked him if he would join us, and he did. And so then it's been more or less the four of us. We've added Zach here the last year or so since the last convention. He's there a lot. And Zach, you know, he brings something to the table. Hopefully someday he'll bring more. But and John, we never give up on John. We're always hoping John's going to
someday I'll bring something to the table.
I brought a fish to the table once and said nobody wanted it, so I took it home.
See,
and
and
cooked it.
James doesn't come and join us because I just insult everybody that's on the on the group with
That's
me.
the real reason James isn't joining.
He's
Yeah.
But I keep on inviting him. I need a new target. But anyway,
John needs a break from being targeted. Invite James.
James, I've spoken with James on my show a few times and working on projects together. James can handle himself in a room. Believe me,
Okay.
I know this for a
James
fact.
will
So we have
all
to
around me and
get
take
it
me out.
get it in the book sometime.
James is the Fred Allen to Buck Benny here.
No. I think it's definitely John. John is. I was gonna ask even John, are you gonna start a feud with Buck coming up?
The feud is already on. Actually,
It's already on.
on our first time we talked on video, we said because we were friends and amicable at that time, and then we said, you know what would be fun if we were enemies? Let's do a Fred Allen Jack Benny feud, and we've been enemies ever since.
Yes, of course.
And it
Yeah,
is fun to
it's
do, and
definitely
it makes it a little
evident.
more interesting doing it that way, I think. So it's fun. I did want to mention one thing that's been in the chat going back and forth, and I told folks in the chat that I would mention it. One of the reasons we all love to do our podcasts and love to do Jack Benny is, one, there's so much that exists out there that you find, but there's new stuff all the time that's being discovered, that's old interviews, whatever. And the newest thing I know of, and who knows, it could have been kicking around forever, and you guys might have had copies of it, who knows from when, but it's the John Lennon, Jack Benny thing we mentioned the other night, and some folks have brought that up again. I was just playing with it today, seeing if I could bring part of it out for us, but it's just not going to work. But it's one of those things. Jack is so interesting, seeing what's his take going to be on something. What are we going to find out new about him? And we have two things going on. You have new things you find with Jack, and then there's always some frustration that goes with it. And that frustration mixed with the excitement is what keeps us digging and looking for things. And this one is a perfect example, because what you have is essentially like a 40-minute interview of ones of Jack, ones of John. Then the last 3 minutes of the stupid thing, Jack asked Mr. Lemon a question, and the audience just starts cracking up, and you could tell Jack didn't mean it. He meant Lennon, but he said lemon. And anyway, he asked a question about Vietnam, and the dialogue those two have back and forth is so wonderful. It's only 3 minutes long. And you just and the person at the end is going, well, this is a pretty serious note, but we have to end the show and blah blah blah. And I'm like, keep going. This is so. Why didn't they do this for the whole? Just hearing those two talk for the whole 40 minutes would have been so interesting. But it's what else makes it interesting is you never know what Jack's going to do. In this case, John is just after the bet in, so he's had the bet in. It's a week later. Everybody's criticizing him, like everybody in the audience. They interview him. Well, you were just a jerk to do that. Why would you do that? You're just trying to draw attention to yourself. And then the reporters are asking questions like, well, why didn't you just tell us what your feelings are instead of having this bet in? And I'm like, dude, the guy had every microphone on the planet pointed at him for a week because he did this bet in. That was the whole thing. And he can't really say that direct out, but he is kind of saying it. And then, so you get all these people criticizing him, and then you get Jack that comes in from a completely different angle of kind of respect and kind of I just want to know your opinion on this. what do you think about Vietnam? What do you think about this? What do you think about the next thing? Here's my concern. And Jack presents a concern that's pretty standard for folks saying, oh, well, if we backed out of Vietnam, all of a sudden communists would take over the planet and blah, blah, blah. But I just thought it was great how much respect he gave to John when everybody else was dissing him, because he could have come in and just on his high horse and just sort of said, oh, I'm going to do like everybody else. I'm going to make fun of him and I'm going to make a joke of Mr. Lennon, but he didn't. And I thought that was so interesting and so perfect to Jack, and it shows us we're always finding new things out about Jack.
With that clip, by the way, I'm currently trying to figure out with the OBS system how to play those audio clips, and James was a test subject. So if everybody does want to hear it by the end of the night before we jump into our big Benny After Dark event, I will gladly take some time during one of the panels that I don't need to be a part of to set that clip up so that people can hear it. I do apologize, but Buck is right. That's a wonderful thing about Benny fandom, is that we're finding new stuff every day, whether it's in print or any other format. And that interview blew my mind away, which shout out to Jamie Dyer from the fan club. He's a podcaster too. And he shared that on the Facebook thread not too long ago. And it blew everybody's mind away. It was a wonderful thing to see pop up in that feed.
Yeah, his perspective is so good, in the sense of that he does have those very respectful conversations with performers that sometimes are volatile at the time or more popular. He's very good at blending the old with the new. Jack is like perfect for that, more so than I think a lot of his fellow vaudeville stars. I did want to ask John, since you also you have your own podcast, you do the research as well. This day in Jack Benny, you often pick out kind of different jokes that are in an episode. And what are some of the more obscure jokes that you found, or that were really difficult to kind of discern what this was in reference to?
Oh, there have been a few that I've never been able to find, but I'm doing a new one every week. After a week, if I can't find it, I give up, and I just feel sad. And there's a few, and I'm embarrassed because I go back and I listen to my old episode, and I see a few things that I've gotten totally wrong. But when I first started listening, there were these jokes, and everybody in the audience laughed, and I laughed along too, even though I had no idea what they meant. And then I was listening with my wife, and she's like, "Oh, who's that? Who's I don't know, Marilyn Monroe. Well, I don't know, some kind of actress. Who's Barbara Stanwyck?" And then they get more and more obscure. So I would say one of the most obscure things that I often mention, because it took me forever to find, was Eastern Columbia, Broadway at 9th. If you Google Eastern Columbia, Broadway at 9th, you don't get anything. And that was a joke that they kept doing over and over and over again. I'm like, what are you talking about? What does that mean? They're random words. But eventually I found out that Eastern Columbia was the name of a department store, and then the cross streets in Los Angeles or whatever were Broadway and 9th. And so that's what they were talking about. So now that I hear it, it makes perfect sense. It doesn't seem obscure, but I couldn't find it forever. There's also the guy who they mention all the time.
Norman Krasna?
No, well, that guy too. The guy who's Petrillo, the musicians union leader. Mm-hmm. The one name, Petrillo, and how do you find it? So yeah, I don't keep track of the all the different references. So I wish I could think of a more obscure one.
We need to have a crowdsourcing of all of your questions, and we'll just put them into the Jack Benny Fan Club Facebook.
Well,
I'm sure you probably have.
I've tried that. I've tried asking my questions in the Jack Benny Fan Club, and nobody knows. I've tried it 2 or 3 times on the really obscure one, and I never get an answer.
I did real quick want, as we're drawing to a close here, I have 2 kind of really quick questions. Is there anything that anybody wants to plug? Any merch or besides their podcast, anything that you want to share? No, everybody's good. Okay.
I want to plug one thing. Sorry,
Okay.
just because, not for me, but really for John, for Zach, for Kathy, who's brilliant, for Terry. I mean, I really think if you want to have some fun, tune into our just type in Buck Benny in YouTube, and you'll find all of our videos. And we've introed, I think, 75 Jack Benny shows, specials, things where we, sometimes our intros almost as long as the show, but I think it's neat to hear all these perspectives. It's like having the Jack Benny convention, but all year long. So I just love doing them. I hope John and Zach are still enjoying doing them. I think we are.
I not only am, Buck, but here's something we can promote. Yesteryear Ballyhoo Review, REVUE, is teaming up with Buck Benny OTR on Sunday at 5 p.m. Pacific. We will be doing an interview with Stuart Kanan, in which it will be part of a mega episode dedicated to the Benny Allen feud. So we are going to be talking with Stuart about his life and career and how he kicked off an entire comedy feud. Yeah, so you will get to see a live version of the podcast happen.
I have one more question, and I'm going to steal, and I've done this before, so I apologize, Mark. I'm going to steal a line from you because I love it so much.
Please do.
Who was Jack Benny, and what does he mean to you?
Wow.
Well, I have to answer that question constantly because nobody knows who Jack Benny is.
We do.
I just say, Jack Benny was a hilarious comedian from old time radio, and whenever I listen, I have fun.
Jack, for me, is a reminder that it is okay to be imperfect. And it is okay to recognize your faults and frailties, and to not dwell in them, but to find some humor in them as you keep going along. I think the only reason I can learn and grow in life, but also with the podcast, is because I listened to Jack at a very young age, and it taught me how to. Him along with Mel Brooks taught me how to be myself. Jack from one angle and Mel from a completely different other one. So I think he's a reminder that human beings are an imperfect but lovely species, and he exemplifies the best of it.
What about you, James?
I would say that Jack Benny was the most important and influential comedian of the first half of the 20th century. I think that's the way I would describe him, even though he clearly lived into the second half of the 20th century. Also, if people who watch Curb Your Enthusiasm or any Woody Allen movie who don't know who Jack Benny is, well, you're listening to or watching someone who has clearly been heavily influenced by Jack Benny. In this case, I mean Larry David and Woody Allen.
Seinfeld as well, of course.
Seinfeld,
right,
yeah.
Seinfeld, Larry David, right. So, yeah, but Jerry also.
And a lot of comedians.
Yeah, and so I just wanted to say really quickly, because Zach was mentioning how Buck and Zach are going to interview Stuart Kanan. My March Breaking Walls episode is called Radio and St. Patrick's Day on the Air. And so because of that, Fred Allen passed away on St. Patrick's Day, 1956. Oh. And 19 years, basically to the day, plus 3 days, prior to his death was when him and Benny sold out the Pierre Hotel for the feud episode. That was March 14th, 1937. It was over Benny's show. So this feud and Fred Allen will be a very big part of my March episode of Breaking Walls, because Zach and I are looking to do something, I guess, kind of like what Mark you're doing with, have done with Carson, in the sense that, people are just dying to talk about Carson. If you ask them about Carson, Zach and I are looking to do something similar with Fred Allen. So, we've had some preliminary discussions about that because, we're saying who remembers Benny? Nobody. Well, less people remember Fred Allen than Benny. And
that's true. You only kind of remember him if you kind of are into some very niche stuff like Jack Benny.
Right.
So I want to go Buck, then Mark, because we'll end with Mark's question. It'll be appropriate to end with Mark.
All good. I don't know. I don't know if I can tell you what I think of Jack Benny and who he is without crying or something. He's just the greatest entertainer I've ever known. He went from from vaudeville to radio, from radio to television. All of his fans, all of us on this panel, have brought him into, whether he wanted to or not, into the technical age of the post 2000s, and there's no sign of his shows or him losing his influence on so many people. I just think he showed us that humor didn't have to be mean, and it could be gentle, and it could be fun, and it could be and you honor the people around you. I mean, the reason that I do what I do, and the reason that I've started to involve a panel of people, is no coincidence that Jack happened to do the same thing, but surround himself with people that were talented and show off their talents and things. And I feel like I try and do a lot of the things that Jack does, and I try and be like Jack in so many ways, whether it's what he was like as a true entertainer or what he was like in real life, and his generosity and all of those things in real life. I try and grab onto that. One of the main things I try and grab onto, that I think everybody should try and grab onto, was just how much anything he did, anything he experienced, was the biggest thing in the world at the time. It was, oh, this sandwich is the best sandwich I've ever had, and so forth. It just celebrate your life, celebrate the things that you do with your family, with your friends. Make it be big, make it be something epic. Even if it's not, make the little things epic. And it's just a joy that I have, that I've enjoyed who I am and what I do more since listening to Jack and getting to know Jack than I did before. And I don't know what else you can say better than that about a person.
Yeah. And Mark, I am interested in hearing your perspective as someone that really kind of got to know Jack through another comedian, and that's similar to my story.
I just think Jack oozed likability like Carson. You can't have longevity like that unless you're likable. And there's just something about him that, the same with Carson, where it's just like, it just seems like a regular guy you'd want to hang out with, that would make jokes. I love the fact that he wasn't afraid on his show for other performers to get huge laughs. There are comedians who and other people are getting the laughs. Yeah, they'll nix it. I just like he was a gentle soul. I always heard he was nice. I just remembered one of my friends who worked at the Tonight Show in New York when it was still there. Jack Benny was in the offices, was in Fred DeCordova's office because they were still friends. And Jack Benny told the assistant to Fred, Barbara Meltzer, she was on my podcast. She said, "Fred is the funniest person I've ever met." And for someone like Jack to say that about somebody else, or maybe he believed it, I don't know. It just seemed he was really generous with this compliment. And his stuff is still funny. I mean, there's stuff 20 years ago that people considered funny that wouldn't play, the audiences wouldn't laugh at today. I mean, it's one of those things with like the Marx Brothers or something, where you could always go back, and it's just a testament to his amazing talent and likability, I think.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Buck, what a special portrayal, because your words are very true. And thank you everybody for agreeing to be here, because I think all of you offer something different to everyone here. I know that we have listeners, new listeners and old listeners alike, that gain perspective from all of you. So I'm so glad to have you all here. And we're actually going to be, I think the next one is Kathy, John Henderson and Kathy.
Yeah, that's right.
Next. So I know a lot of us draw a lot of resources from Kathy. She has a great textbooks about Jack. So I'm really excited to hear what you have to say, Kathy. I'm so glad to have you as a friend. All right. Thank you guys so much.
Really quickly before I unpin everybody in this panel, I think we can all agree here that we wouldn't, not only would we not be here without Hope, but her passion for podcasting needs to resume, because All of the Classics is one of the finest shows I've ever listened to, has interviews with Laura Leibowitz, Catherine Fuller Seeley, and so many more. And it is imperative that you go check out her show and then encourage her politely and respectfully to continue
return.
her fine work.
I might need to find a support system. I don't wanna tap you because you have a lot of stuff you're already editing. Because I cannot edit hour-long shows anymore.
We'll build a robot for you.
Yeah,
We'll call
okay,
it we'll call it
okay.
We'll call it Hopatron, and the first question it'll ask is, "What is love?" And
Dang it, don't hurt me.
Mark got it.